Hundreds of millions of people have now heard the Hopi Blue Star prophecy. Not one of them has ever seen the original. There is no original. No recording was ever made, and there is no manuscript sitting in any Hopi archive. What there is a car. One hot afternoon in the summer of 1958, on an empty highway in the desert southwest, a Methodist minister named David Young pulled onto the shoulder and offered a ride to an old man walking alone in the heat. That ride is the source. Every version you have ever encountered traces back to it. Every video and every quote card, every solemn reading laid over footage of comets and mesas. The old man accepted with a nod and said nothing for the first few miles. Then he spoke. He said his name was White Feather, and that he was a Hopi of the ancient Bear clan. He said his sons were dead, and that the ceremonies of his people were dying with them. And then, on that hot vinyl seat somewhere between one dusty town and the next, he began to describe the end of the world. 9 signs, he said. 9 warnings handed down by his ancestors, and almost every one of them had already come to pass. Weapons that struck like thunder, snakes of iron laid across the country, a giant spider's web thrown over the land, and rivers of stone that made pictures in the sun. And then the last one, a dwelling place in the heavens above the earth, that would fall with a great crash, and it would appear as a blue star. After that, Whitefeather said, the ceremonies of his people would cease and the fourth world would end. Then he got out of the car, and in the 68 years since, nobody has ever worked out who he was. That part matters more than almost anything else you will hear tonight, so let me put it plainly. No family has ever claimed that elder. He appears in the passenger seat of a stranger's vehicle in 1958, delivers what became the most quoted Native American prophecy on Earth, and disappears out of the historical record entirely. You have almost certainly seen this handed to you as hard history, documented in 1958. Those 3 words get repeated with total confidence, as though a careful researcher had sat down with Hopi elders, switched on a tape recorder, and captured something sealed and ancient straight from the source. They get used as proof that an old desert people, farming corn on 3 high mesas in northern Arizona, somehow saw our exact century coming. But chase that date and it comes apart in your hands, because the earliest copy of that 9-sign text anybody has ever been able to find in print does not come from 1958. It does not come from 1959 or 1963. It surfaces in 1980, in a paperback about coming Earth changes, more than 20 years after a conversation nobody can verify ever took place. And yet, here is why I could not leave this alone. Underneath that shaky story there is a second one, and it is documented right down to the dates. In my opinion, it is far stranger and far more moving than the version that went viral. Because other Hopi elders, named men on the public record, really did carry a warning off that reservation. In 1948, 4 of them were chosen and sent out into the world. When somebody put a photograph of a mushroom cloud in front of them, they looked at it and identified it, by name as a thing their own prophecies had described long before it existed. And they had been taught something else too, that the nations of the earth would one day gather inside a great house of mica to settle their quarrels without going to war, and that when that house appeared, the Hopi were to go and knock on the door. It took 44 years to get through it. By the time it opened, only one of those 4 men was still standing well enough to walk in. The last one made it. On the 10th of December 1992, an 83-year-old farmer who had spent 7 years in an American prison for refusing to register for the draft stood up inside the General Assembly of the United Nations, sprinkled cornmeal on the carpet beside the podium, and delivered the message he had been handed as a young man. Then he looked up and found that most of the room had already gone home. That happened. It is in the record. You can read the text. So this is not going to be a video about whether a prophecy came true. That question is a trap, and it flattens everything interesting about this. The question underneath it is harder and much better. Which part of all this is actually Hopi and which part is us? Some of what follows is thin ground, and I will tell you when we are standing on it. Some of it is as solid as a line scratched in the dirt outside an Arizona village in 1906, which runs father to son all the way to the floor of the United Nations. And one question stays open the whole way because it is the one that has bothered me most. If the real version has been sitting there in print this entire time, in English, free to read, published by the Hopi themselves, then why is it the shaky one that conquered the world? Why does everyone alive know about a blue star, and almost nobody knows the name Thomas Banyatzia? We will get there. But first, all 9 of those signs, properly, because you cannot judge a story until you have heard the whole of it. Chapter 1. The 9 Signs, The version that circulates online almost always arrives in the same shape. It is a countdown. 9 signs given in order, each one a warning that the fourth world is running out of time. First, white-skinned men arrive. They take land that is not theirs, and there they strike their enemies with thunder. Guns. Then come spinning wheels filled with voices. In the text, White Feather says his own father watched that one arrive with his own eyes. Wagons full of families rolling across the prairie. Sign 3 is a strange beast. Something like a buffalo, but with great long horns. And it overruns the land in vast numbers. Longhorn cattle. Snakes of iron cross the country, railroads. A giant spider's web goes up across the land. Telegraph wire and power cable, though some modern retellings quietly upgrade this one to the internet. Rivers of stone that make pictures in the sun, paved highway, and that shimmering mirage of water you get on hot asphalt. 7th, you will hear of the sea turning black and many living things dying because of it. Oil spills. The 8th is a generation of young people who wear their hair long like the Hopi and come to the tribal nations to learn their ways, which almost everybody reads as the hippies. And then the last one. A dwelling place in the heavens falls to earth with a great crash, and it appears as a blue star. After the 9th sign, the story says, the fourth world ends. Somewhere in the retellings, this fuses with a separate idea, the Blue Star Kachina, Sakwasohu, who will come and dance in the plaza during a night dance, and then take off his mask in front of the uninitiated, and that unmasking is the beginning of the purification. Now, if you have never looked closely at that list before, it lands hard. It sounds like somebody with no access to the 20th century describing the 20th century. But go back and read it again with one question in your head, and something uncomfortable happens. Ask yourself, in what year could a person have written this? Nobody can answer that with certainty because there is no manuscript to date. But the internal evidence points somewhere fairly specific, and it points there hard. Because every single sign is described in the vocabulary of the thing it is supposedly predicting, not in the vocabulary of somebody who has never seen it. A person who had never once encountered a railroader would not naturally reach for snakes of iron. That is what a railroad looks like to somebody who already knows what a railroad is and is choosing a poetic image for it. Same with the web across the sky, same with rivers of stone. These are not the fumbling descriptions of a mind reaching for something it cannot picture. They are elegant metaphors, and elegant metaphors come after the fact. Then look at the sequencing: guns, wagons, cattle, railroads, wires, highways, oil, long-haired youth. It is a perfect chronological march through American westward expansion, arriving neatly at the late 1950s and stopping there. Every sign that is described concretely had already happened by the time the story was written down. The only one left vague, the only one with no fixed referent, is the last one. The Blue Star, the one that has not happened yet. That pattern has a name, and it is a standard tool of textual analysis rather than anything I've invented for this video. Scholars call it prophecy after the event or retrodiction. It is not a Hopi phenomenon, and it is not a Native American phenomenon. It shows up in prophetic literature all over the world, in more or less every century and every religion that has produced any. A text is composed at a certain moment. It describes everything up to that moment in vivid detail because the author lived through it, and then it goes cloudy about the future because nobody actually knows. And the researcher who dug hardest into the paper trail here, a writer named Jason Colavito, noticed something else. The 9 signs are soaked in Christian apocalyptic imagery. The structure, the numbered signs, the falling from heaven, the world ending in judgment, the tone of the whole thing. His conclusion was blunt. He does not think David Young was a passive channel who simply wrote down what he heard. He thinks Young shaped it, though a hatchet job would be just as dishonest as the thing it is attacking, so let me give the other side properly. None of that proves the whole thing is fabricated. Hopi oral tradition is real and it is old, carried for centuries by people who took it with total seriousness. There are elements in this text that do echo genuine Hopi teaching. Previous worlds destroyed, a coming purification, and oral traditions legitimately absorb new language as they travel. A teaching about a coming disruption can pick up modern vocabulary in the retelling, without the underlying teaching being fake. So the honest position is not that it is all invented. The honest position is this: the tidy 9-sign countdown, the Blue Star, the specific packaging that spread across the world, is the least verifiable part of Hopi prophecy, and the confident little phrase documented in 1958 is doing a great deal of work it has not earned. This is not a document. It is a story about a story, which raises the question that sent me down this road in the first place. If not from that car, then from where? And underneath that, a question that hardly ever gets asked at all. Who is actually allowed to tell you what the Hopi believe? To answer that, we have to leave 1958 behind entirely and go back 52 years further to a September afternoon in 1906, when two men held a shoving match in the dirt outside the oldest continuously inhabited town in North America. Because that fight is the reason there was anyone left holding a prophecy at all. But before we get there, you need to understand who these people actually are, not the postcard version, the real one. Chapter 2. 8 inches of rain, northeastern Arizona. High desert, roughly 6,000 feet above sea level. A country of pale rock and blue distance where you can stand in one spot and see for 100 miles in every direction. 3 long fingers of stone push south out of a great plateau. They are called, without much romance, First Mesa, Second Mesa, and Third Mesa. And on top of them, clinging to the edges of cliffs, are villages made of the same stone they are standing on. One of those villages is Oraibi. You will usually see it written as Oraibi or Old Oraibi. People have been living there continuously since before the year 1100. That is not a legend, that is archaeology. When the first stones were laid at Oraibi, the Norman conquest of England was recent news. The cathedral at Chartres had not been built. It is, by most reckonings, the oldest continuously inhabited settlement in what is now the United States, and it is still there. Now here is the part I find hardest to get my head around. That plateau gets between 6 and 10 inches of rain a year. In some years less. For comparison, the average across the United States is about 30 inches. Ask a conventional agronomist how much rainfall corn needs, and they will tell you 33 inches. There is no river running through those villages. There is no irrigation. And the Hopi have been growing corn there for around 3,000 years. They do it by a method called dry farming, and once you understand it, you stop thinking of these people as picturesque and start thinking of them as engineers. Instead of tilling the soil, which would let the moisture escape, they leave it alone. Instead of planting an inch down in tidy rows, they take a wooden planting stick, a sawyer, and they dig down 6, 12, sometimes 18 inches until they find the damp layer left behind by the winter snow. Then they drop 8 or 10 kernels into a single hole and space the holes far apart, so the stalks come up in tight little clumps like bushels rather than rows, sheltering each other from the wind that scours sand across that plateau all summer. Then they wait for the July monsoon. A Hopi farmer and scientist named Michael Katutwa Johnson, who is by his own count a 250th generation dry farmer, was once sitting in a lecture hall at Cornell, listening to a professor explain that corn needs 33 inches of rain, and he laughed out loud. He had already raised thousands of ears in a place that gets under 10. Somebody once asked him why he does not just irrigate and increase the yield. His answer was one sentence. Well, then what would we pray for? There is the entire theology, in 9 words, from a man who was making a joke. Because the Hopi understanding of themselves rests on an agreement. In the tradition, when the people emerged into this world, they met Marsor, the caretaker of this land, a figure who owns the earth and also guards the dead. And Marsor offered them a bargain. In the version most often told, he had nothing to give them but a planting stick, a bag of seed corn, a gourd of water, and a life of hard work in a poor place. Other peoples took the long fat ears of corn and the easy country. The Hopi took the short blue ear and the hard ground, and in exchange they took on a duty: keep the ceremonies, keep the land, keep the world in balance for everyone, not only for themselves. Farming in a desert that should not support farming is not incidental to that agreement. It is the proof of it. Every ear of corn that comes out of that sand is evidence the covenant is being kept. That agreement is the thing you will need later. When these people talk about the world falling out of balance, they are not being poetic. They are describing a breach of contract. And there is one point that almost every viral retelling of Hopi prophecy gets wrong at the most basic level. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is no such thing as the Hopi prophecy. Not because it does not exist, but because that phrase assumes a structure the Hopi do not have. There is no Hopi Bible. There is no central authority that ratifies doctrine. Each village is politically independent, historically to the point of being able to go to war with its neighbours. Within each village there are clans, and knowledge belongs to clans. The Bear Clan holds things the Fire Clan does not. The Fire Clan holds things the Sun Clan does not. Much of it is esoteric, meaning it is reserved for people who have been initiated into a particular religious society, and revealing it to the uninitiated is not a minor breach of etiquette. It is a serious act. The Danish scholar Armin Geertz, who spent decades on this and wrote what is still the standard academic book on Hopi prophecy, put it in a line I have not been able to get out of my head. Among the Hopi, he wrote, there is prophecy, but there are no prophets. That distinction does a lot of work. In the traditions most of us grew up around, prophecy is a person. A named individual receives a message and delivers it. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Nostradamus. The prophecy belongs to the prophet. Hopi prophecy does not work like that. It is collective and clan-based, held in common by a lineage, recited by whoever is entitled to recite it. There is no single mouth it comes out of, which means the very format of the story you have been told, one wise elder revealing the sealed prophecy of his people to a stranger in a car, is alien to the way this knowledge actually lives. That does not make it impossible. It should make you slow down, and it means that if you go looking for a Hopi prophecy to quote, you will not find a text. You will find dozens of partial, overlapping, sometimes contradictory traditions held by different families in different villages, most of them not meant for outsiders at all. So the moment somebody hands you a clean numbered list, ask who flattened it and why. So the question stops being what does the prophecy say, and becomes something more interesting. What happened to these people that made a handful of them decide to start speaking outward to strangers in English about things that were never meant to leave the mesa? The answer is not mystical at all. It is brutally political, and it starts with children. Chapter 3. The Alcatraz 19 when in 1882, by an executive order signed by President Chester Arthur, a reservation was drawn around the Hopi villages. Nobody consulted the Hopi. The boundaries left out several of their sacred shrines, and the whole thing was surrounded on all sides by the far larger Navajo reservation, which planted a land dispute that is still going. Then came the schools. In 1887, the federal government opened a boarding school at Keams Canyon. The policy behind it was not education in any sense you would recognize. It was assimilation, and its architects said so openly. Children were to be removed from their families, forbidden their language, cut off from their ceremonies, given English names, and returned as something else. In 1890, the United States Army came onto Third Mesa and took 104 Hopi children away to Keams Canyon, and the villages split down the middle over how to respond. Some families sent their children on the calculation that the government was not going away and that a child who could read English might protect the rest. Government agents labelled those families the friendlies. Other families refused outright, on the grounds that the covenant with Marsaw made it impossible. The agents called those families the hostiles. I want to stop on that for 1 second because those two words have shaped every English language account of Hopi history for a century, and neither of them is Hopi. They are administrative categories invented by Indian agents to describe how much trouble a family was giving them. Friendly meant compliant, hostile meant inconvenient, and once those labels were written into government reports, they hardened into what looked like two political parties, and eventually the Hopi themselves started using them, because that is what happens when somebody else names your quarrel. When the refusals continued, the government escalated. On the 25th of November, 1894, soldiers arrested 19 men from Moravi, all of them village leaders. The charge was sedition. The actual offence was refusing to hand over their children and refusing to farm the way Washington instructed. They were taken to Fort Defiance, and then by foot, horse, train and boat, roughly 1,000 miles west. On the rainy morning of the 3rd of January 1895, 19 Hopi men stood on the Clay Street Wharf in San Francisco, wrapped in striped blankets, waiting for the prison boat. None of them spoke English. It is unlikely any of them had ever seen the ocean. They were taken to Alcatraz. Not the Alcatraz of Al Capone, not yet. In 1895 it was a military prison, a cold rock in the middle of a freezing bay with wooden cells, bad sanitation and worse ventilation. They were sentenced to hard labour. They were held from the 3rd of January until early August, and they did not reach home until September of 1895. Their leader was a man named Lomahongyuma. His right hand, an older and frailer man, was named Ukiuma. Remember that name. Some sources spell it Ukioma, some Ukiuma. He is about to become the most important person in this entire story, and outside northern Arizona his name means nothing to anybody. And while those 19 men sat on that rock, the San Francisco papers ran the story. One headline read, roughly, "A batch of Apaches." 19 murderous-looking Apache Indians, the article said, had been landed at Alcatraz Island. They were not Apache. They were Hopi. The paper could not tell the difference and did not check. It went on to explain cheerfully that the men would remain prisoners until they had learned to appreciate the advantages of education. 19 farmers from the driest corner of Arizona, whose entire religion is built on peace, in a military prison in San Francisco Bay, described in the newspaper as murderers for the crime of keeping their children at home. They came home in September of 1895 to a village that had been torn in half in their absence. And the fight was not over. Over the next decade it got very much worse. 11 years after those men stepped off the boat, Oravi tore itself apart. And the way it happened is one of the strangest events in American history, and it is almost never told properly. Chapter 4. The Line in the Sand. By 1906, Oravi was a pressure cooker. The village had somewhere around 750 people in it, which made it easily the largest Hopi settlement and, in the eyes of many Hopi, the capital. It had swelled because a group of traditionalists from the village of Shungapavi, on Second Mesa, had been forced out of their own community over the same school fight and had come to Oravi to join the resistance there. So now both factions were concentrated in one place, on top of a cliff, with winter coming. The friendlies were led by a man named Tawaquaptewa, born in 1871 to the Bear clan, who became village chief in 1904 at around 33 years old. He was the nephew and chosen successor of the previous chief Lulolma, and he was picked ahead of older brothers who had been considered first. He inherited the quarrel knowing exactly what he was inheriting, and he carried on his uncle's policy of encouraging school attendance. On the other side stood Yukiuma, the old man who had been on Alcatraz, and who now held the position of Fire Clan leader and keeper of the Fire Clan's stone tablets. Those tablets matter. On Third Mesa, the Fire Clan and the Bear Clan each hold a stone tablet inscribed with the terms of their inheritance, and part of those terms covers what happens if one of them weakens. If one clan gives way to outside pressure, the other inherits the authority and the land, which means that what looks from the outside like two men disagreeing about schools reads very differently from the inside. If you take that tablet tradition at face value, and the people involved certainly did, then what happened next was not a squabble. It was a formal test of who was still keeping the covenant, and the loser had already agreed in advance what losing meant, and the village was falling apart. Ceremonies require both halves of a community to cooperate, and the two factions had stopped cooperating. Rituals that had run without a break for centuries were failing. A Mennonite missionary named Heinrich Voth, who had spent years at Oravi and who is himself a deeply complicated figure in this history, was trying to prevent an outright civil war. There had already been fighting at Shungapavi. Meanwhile, there was a food shortage and a smallpox epidemic in the background. People were exhausted. Then, on the 6th of September 1906, Yukiuma walked over to Tawaquaptewa and proposed something extraordinary. He suggested they settle it with a contest. A line was drawn on the ground. The terms were simple. The two factions would face each other across that line and push. Whichever leader was forced to cross it would take his people and leave Oravi forever. No weapons, no blood. Shoving match for the future of the oldest town in America. The sources differ on what happened next, and I would rather say so than pretend to a certainty nobody has. Some accounts describe it as a pushing contest, two masses of men shoving chest to chest. Others describe it as a pull, more like a tug of war with the two chiefs at the centre trying to drag one another across the line. Some accounts have the two leaders fighting it out personally, with their followers packed in behind them. What every account agrees on is the line in the dirt, the terms, and the fact that it went on for hours because the two sides were evenly matched. There is also a darker version. In Dan Avahima's account, and in reporting that drew on it, the day was uglier than the tidy story suggests. Traditionalists were dragged out of their homes by the hair and marched to the edge of the village. Whether that happened before the contest, after it, or as part of the general chaos of the day depends on who is telling it. And there is a reason we have that particular detail, which I find quietly astonishing. Dan Avahima was 13 years old on the 6th of September, 1906. He watched it happen. His father was involved. And Dan Avahima lived until 1999. He died at somewhere around 106 years of age, which means that a man who personally witnessed the breakup of Aravi was still alive and still giving interviews within living memory of most people watching this. However it unfolded exactly, the outcome is not in dispute. After hours of struggle, Yukiuma was forced across the line. He lost, and then he did something that reads like scripture. He walked a short distance and he drew a second line in the dirt with his own foot, and he said, in the version the Hopi themselves published decades later in their own newsletter, "Thank you. Now from this point on all the land is mine." In another rendering from Dan Evahima, he said that from here on all the land was under his care, and that the people in Aravi would have only the village. Then he stepped over his own line and walked west. He had lost the contest, accepted the terms, and in the same motion redefined the terms. You keep the town, I take the country. It is one of the most quietly defiant things I have ever read about, and the line he scratched in that dirt was reportedly still visible on the ground generations later. Though I should tell you that the Hotevilla elders themselves, in the very first issue of the newsletter they would publish 70 years later, do not frame it as defiance at all. They tell it structurally. In their account, Tawaquaptewa evicted the Fire Clan, and in the act of evicting them he gave away part of his own authority. He kept the village and nothing past its outskirts. Yukiuma took everything else, which suggests that what looks to us like a proud gesture from a beaten man read, to the people who were standing there, as a transfer of power that something older than either of them had already settled. That night, Yukiuma and his people walked a few miles west and founded a new village. They called it Hotevilla, and the practical reality of that gets swallowed by the romance of it every single time. It was September. Winter on that plateau is severe. They had no houses. They had no stored harvest at the new site. They had walked away from a village their ancestors had occupied for 800 years into open ground, with children, in order to not send those children to a government school. Aravi never recovered. A settlement of around 750 people lost roughly half its population in one night. Attempts to reintegrate failed. Bad blood stayed. Within a few years, a second breakaway founded yet another village, Bakavi, under a San Clan leader named Kawanuptewa. By the 1930s, barely 100 people were left in Old Aravi. A town that had stood for the better part of a millennium was effectively a ghost, and the government was not finished with either man. In 1912, Yukiuma was jailed again, this time over a confrontation with the matron of a government school, and Tawaquaptewa, the winner, was shipped off almost immediately to the Sherman Institute in Riverside, California, to be educated himself from 1906 to 1909, a fate he had not volunteered for, so neither of them won, and the neat version of that story is almost certainly wrong. For most of the 20th century, the split was read exactly as I've just described it. Noble traditionalists against compromised progressives, and the traditionalists lost and walked into the desert. Then in 1988, an anthropologist named Peter Whiteley published Deliberate Acts, built on years of work with Hopi consultants, and argued that the split was arranged, that leaders on both sides engineered the whole thing deliberately to dissolve a religious order at Aravi they had come to regard as corrupted. On that reading, the pushing contest was not a solution to a fight at all. It was closer to a ritual, a formal mechanism for ending something the leadership had already decided had to end, which would explain why a shrewd old man like Yukiuma proposed a physical contest he had every reason to expect to lose. Which reading is right, I do not know, and neither does anybody else with certainty. What I will say is that both can be true at once. Real grief, real families walking into the cold, and a deliberate act by leaders who understood exactly what they were doing. Hopi history is politics as much as prophecy, and any version offering you only one of those is selling you something. But here is the thread I need you to keep hold of, because everything after this hangs on it. When people talk about the Hopi prophecy, they are overwhelmingly talking about material that comes from Hotevilla, not from all Hopi, not from the tribe as a whole, from that specific village, founded in one night in September 1906 by the people who lost a shoving match and walked west rather than compromise. These are not a random group of farmers, and the record makes the point for me. They are the descendants of men who went to Alcatraz rather than send their children to school. For decades afterward, they refused government schooling and refused to recognize the tribal council. They kept electricity and water lines out of the village too, not because they did not understand what electricity was, but because they had made a decision in 1906 about what they were willing to let inside the wall, and they were still keeping it in 1968 and in 1998, and later still. A prophecy about civilization losing its balance sounds extremely different once you know it is being carried by the people who refuse to let civilization into their village. And now the detail that ties this whole story into a single line. Yukiuma, the man who drew that line in the dirt in 1906, had a son. His name was Dan Kachongva. He was born at Old Oravi around 1860. He belonged to the Sun clan, and he lived to be well over 100 years old. He was there. He was a grown man of about 46 on the day of the pushing contest, and he walked west with his father that night. And 42 years later, when Hopi elders sat down and chose 4 men to carry a warning to the outside world, Dan Kachongva was one of them. The line drawn in the dirt outside Oravi in 1906 runs, father to son, all the way to the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. That is not myth. That is a family. But before those 4 men were chosen, something happened to the Hopi that shaped everything about how the rest of this plays out. And it did not involve soldiers or schools. It involved paperwork, and it is the reason that to this day when somebody tells you what the Hopi believe, the very first question you should ask is a simple one. Which Hopi? Chapter 5. Which Hopi? In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act. By the standards of American Indian policy, up to that point it was an improvement. It was meant to stop the sale of tribal land and hand back a measure of self-government. The catch was in the phrase self-government, because what Washington meant by self-government was a written constitution, an elected council, majority voting and a recognizable chain of command. In other words, an American municipal government wearing a different hat. The man sent to do it was Oliver Lafarge, a novelist and anthropologist. He was no villain here. He liked the Hopi, and he was clear-eyed enough to write about the whole project a sentence that says everything. The Indians didn't think this up. He wrote the Hopi Constitution himself. Then it went to a referendum in 1936. And what happened in that vote tells you more about the Hopi than any prophecy ever will. The Constitution passed by 651 votes to 104. More than 1,800 eligible voters did not turn out at all. Now, to an American election official, a landslide is a landslide. 651 to 104 is a mandate. But that is not what happened, and Lafarge knew it, and he noted the problem in his own diary at the time. In Hopi practice, decisions are not made by counting heads and letting the larger half impose itself on the smaller. Decisions are reached by discussion until a consensus emerges, and the way you register profound objection to a proposal is not by voting against it, it is by refusing to participate at all. Abstention is the statement. So the traditional villages and the religious leaders, the Kikmungwis, did exactly what their tradition told them to do. They stayed home. In their own terms, they had rejected the Constitution overwhelmingly, and in Washington's terms, they had endorsed it by failing to object. The Hopi Tribal Council was created out of that vote in 1936, and it has been the legally recognized government of the Hopi tribe ever since. Bureau of Indian Affairs records from the period show that officials knew perfectly well how deep the opposition ran. They certified it anyway. From that moment, the Hopi have effectively had 2 governments, one that Washington recognizes, that signs contracts, that holds the seat at the table, and another, older one, made up of hereditary village chiefs and religious societies, which large numbers of Hopi regarded and still regard as the legitimate authority, and which never accepted the council at all. For decades, some villages refused to send representatives to it. Hotevilla, of course, refused hardest of all. Which of those 2 is the real Hopi government is not my call to make, and there are Hopiist people on both sides with serious arguments. But every fight from here on is 2 fights at once, a fight about the thing itself and a fight about who has the right to speak. And the group that starts speaking to the outside world loudly in English, from the late 1940s onward, is one side of that argument. They come to be called the traditionalist movement. They are centred on Hotevilla, they do not recognise the council. And when they tell the world about Hopi prophecy, part of what they are doing, quite openly, is making a case about their own legitimacy. That does not make what they said untrue, it makes it contested. Those are different things, and holding the difference is the whole discipline of this subject. Chapter 6. The Gourd of Ashes. Now we come to August of 1945. On the 6th, an American aircraft dropped a uranium bomb on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, this one plutonium, fell on Nagasaki. Somewhere between 120 and 250,000 people died, most of them civilians, a large number of them in the first few seconds, and on the mesas of northern Arizona, a group of very old men looked at photographs of a mushroom cloud and said with certainty that they knew what they were looking at. In the prophecies they had been taught, there was a thing described as a gourd of ashes. A gourd, if you have not seen one, is a hard-shelled fruit, and a dried gourd full of ash is an ordinary Hopi image, something you might actually have in a house. The teaching held that one day a gourd of ashes would be dropped from the sky. It would boil the earth. It would burn everything for a great distance. And the land where it fell would be poisoned so that nothing would grow there for a long time afterward. When they were shown Hiroshima, the elders said, "That is the gourd of ashes." I want to be careful and precise here, because this is the exact point where honest history and wishful thinking part company. I cannot prove to you that a prophecy describing a gourd of ashes existed in that form before August 1945. Nobody can. It was oral, it was clan-held, and it was not written down beforehand by anyone. It is entirely possible that the image existed and meant something more general, and that it was fitted to the bomb afterward, which would be a textbook piece of retrodiction and would not be dishonest, because that is genuinely how living traditions work. But here is what is documented, and it is the part that actually matters. The identification is on the record. In the years immediately after the war, before Hiroshima had become a global symbol of anything, a group of Hopi elders in one of the poorest and most isolated communities in the United States looked at that photograph and concluded that a line had just been crossed in human history that could not be uncrossed, and that somebody had to go and say so, and then they did something about it. In 1948, at a meeting of traditional religious leaders, the elders selected 4 men to carry the Hopi message and the Hopi warnings to the outside world. You will occasionally see the date given as 1946, and some sources say the process began then and concluded in 1948. I am telling you that because I would rather you know where the edges are. The 4 men were Dan Kachongva, of the Sun clan of Hutavilla, son of Ukiuma, already about 88 years old. David Mononge of the Snake clan, a nephew of Ukiuma, who had also been alive at the 1906 split. Nobody could ever fix his age. Estimates of how old he got range from 105 to 117, and the honest answer is that no one knows. Dan Everhema, of the Greasewood clan, the boy who watched the pushing contest at 13, and a much younger man in his late 30s named Thomas Banyatsia. And Thomas Banyatsia is where this story becomes a life rather than a legend. So let me tell you about him properly, because he deserves it, and because it is hardly ever told. He was born on the 2nd of June 1909 in Moenkopi, a Hopi village out on the western edge of the reservation. When he was sent to school, the Bureau of Indian Affairs required him to use an Anglo name, so for years he was registered as Thomas Jenkins. He went to the Sherman Indian School in Riverside, California, the same institution the government had shipped Tawa off to. Then he went on to Bacone College in Muskogee, Oklahoma, which had been set up for native students. And at Bacone he was studying to become a Christian minister. Given where this whole story began, that detail is almost too neat. The man who ends up as the most credible voice for Hopi prophecy in the world very nearly entered the same profession as the man driving the car in 1958. He did not finish. The college taught nothing about native cultures, and Banyatsia and another student set up a medicine lodge on campus for the other students to use, which tells you which way he was already leaning. He dropped the plan to become a minister, went home, and became a school teacher. He took back a version of his own name. Then came the war. In 1940, the United States introduced conscription, and the Hopi, whose name for themselves means something close to the peaceful people, and whose entire covenant forbids taking up arms, refused to register. The courts rejected their religious objection. Between 1941 and 1949, a number of Hopi men were convicted of draft evasion and sent to the Tucson Federal Prison Camp, a low-security facility where prisoners served their sentences at hard labor, building a highway up into the Santa Catalina Mountains. They were locked up alongside conscientious objectors, Japanese-American resistors, Quakers, Mennonites, and Amish. Thomas Banyatsia was one of them. By his own account and the accounts of those who knew him, he spent around 7 years in prison across that decade, because every time he was released and every time he was ordered to register, he refused again. 7 years, for declining to sign a piece of paper, and when he was asked what had given him the nerve, he pointed at a man who had died before the war. He said he had been inspired by the old Hopi elder Ukiuma, and he called him the Hopi Gandhi, the man who drew the line in the dirt in 1906, reaching forward 40 years to put a schoolteacher in a federal prison camp rather than let him pick up a rifle. Benyatia walked out of prison, and almost immediately the elders chose him as one of the four. He was the youngest by a wide margin, and he was the one who could handle English, courtrooms, journalists, and paperwork. He was the interpreter, in every sense of that word. They gave him a sacred prayer feather, and they gave him instructions, because there was a second image in the prophecies alongside the gourd of ashes, and it was this one that would take him the rest of his life. The teaching spoke of a great house of mica. Mica is a mineral that splits into thin, translucent, glassy sheets, and old Hopi accounts use it as the natural image for glass. In this house of mica, the prophecy said, the leaders of all the nations of the world would one day gather, with rules and regulations, to solve their problems without going to war. And the Hopi were instructed that when that house appeared, they were to go to it and knock on the door and deliver the message. The elders were specific: knock 4 times. The United Nations Charter had come into force on the 24th of October 1945, 10 weeks after Nagasaki. Construction on the Great Glass Secretariat building beside the East River in Manhattan began in 1948, the same year the 4 messengers were chosen. The elders looked at that and said, "There it is. That is the house of mica. Go, it would take 44 years to get through the door." Chapter 7. The Door in the Tradition. There is one more piece of the tradition you need before we go on, because without it the next 40 years make no sense at all. Hopi teaching contains a figure called Pahana. The name gets translated as the true white brother. In the account, at the very beginning, the people were given a sacred stone tablet, and a corner of it was broken off. One brother went east, carrying that missing corner, and the rest of the people settled here. And one day the brother would come back bringing the broken piece with him, and it would fit, and he would help set things right. That is a very old Hopi category, and it has been abused for a very long time. In 1540, a Spanish detachment under Pedro de Tovar, part of the Coronado expedition, became the first Europeans to reach the Hopi villages, and there is a long-standing account that the Hopi tested them against the prophecy and found them wanting, because the Spanish arrived without the broken corner and did not behave like a brother. I should flag that this account reaches us mainly through much later Hopi tellings, rather than through anything written down in 1540. So treat it as tradition, rather than as a documented encounter. What it tells you reliably is not what happened that day. It is how the Hopi later understood what the arrival of Europeans meant inside their own framework. What followed over the next 160 years is one of the harder chapters of Hopi history. Franciscan missions were established. In 1680, the Hopi joined the Pueblo Revolt and drove the Spanish out. And around 1700, when the village of Awatovi readmitted the missionaries, other Hopi destroyed it. The men were killed, the women and children were divided among the surviving villages. Awatovi has been a ruin ever since. I am not telling you that to be lurid. I am telling you because of what it establishes about everything that follows. These people have been arguing about how much of the outside world to let into it for nearly 500 years, and at least once they settled the argument by destroying one of their own villages. The pushing contest at Orivi in 1906 was not an isolated eccentricity. It was the latest round of the oldest fight the Hopi have, and the existence of Pahana means there is a door in the tradition, a slot-marked outsider who returns to help, which is a beautiful idea. It is also, and this is my reading rather than anybody's finding, an enormous vulnerability once you put it into the 20th century. If your tradition contains a slot for a helpful outsider, and outsiders start turning up convinced they are the helpful outsider, the two things are going to meet. And that is broadly what the record shows happening. When white Americans began arriving on those mesas, certain they had come to help, some of them sincerely believing they had a spiritual role to play, that door was standing open. Not everyone who walked through it was honest, and not everyone who was honest was harmless. Chapter 8. The Men Who Came to Listen. Here is what nobody expected, least of all the 4 men. When the Hopi started speaking outward, the outside world listened. But it did not listen the way they had hoped. It listened for its own reasons. The first person to really find them was not a journalist or an anthropologist. He was a wandering American radical named Ammon Hennessy. Hennessy is a remarkable figure. He was a Christian anarchist, a Catholic worker, a tax resister, a vegetarian, a man who did not own a car, and who fasted and picketed federal buildings on the anniversary of Hiroshima every single year. He had refused to fight in the First World War and refused again in the Second. He had done serious prison time for it, including a stretch in solitary confinement where, by his own account, he read the Sermon on the Mount over and over until he came out a pacifist for life. Hennessy found the Hopi through prison. He struck up a correspondence with a Hopi man named Chester Mote, one of the men convicted of draft evasion, and through Mote, he was introduced to Thomas Banyatzia. They wrote to each other for 2 years before they met in person. In August 1949, Hennessy travelled to the snake dance at Mishongnovai at the invitation of Mote and Banyatzia, and he was taken to a Ravi and he went home evangelized. For Hennessy, the Hopi were not a curiosity, they were proof. Here was a functioning society thousands of years old that was pacifist, that refused the draft, that refused taxes, that governed by consensus rather than by majority coercion, and that had been resisting the federal government continuously for 60 years without firing a shot. Everything he had been arguing for his whole life, apparently already working in the desert, in real life. That perception is not entirely wrong, but you can already feel what is going to happen to it. Because Hennessy started telling people. And the people he told were the American peace movement, the anarchist press, the pacifist networks, the little magazines, and then the next generation found it. And the man who carried it furthest was named Craig Carpenter. Carpenter had left Michigan in the 1940s and come out to California chasing one question, which the anthropologist Brian Haley phrases as, "Is civilization right or wrong?" He fell in with the occult and metaphysical scene that would later be called the New Age. And in 1955 he found the Hopi traditionalist faction and joined it. He was not Hopi, and according to Haley, who went through the genealogies, he was not Mohawk either, although he became one over roughly those same years, adopting an identity he had no ancestral claim to. Haley has a term for this, neo-Indians. People without the ancestry or community ties they claimed, who built themselves a traditional Indian identity out of Western romanticism and metaphysics and Hopi prophecy, and then went out and taught it to others. Haley's finding is that nobody chronicling this story before him had recognized how many of the people carrying Hopi tradition to the world were in that category. And in 1966, Craig Carpenter did something with consequences he could not possibly have foreseen. There was a late-night call-in show on KPFK, the Pacifica station in Los Angeles, called Radio Free Oz. One evening, the hosts were talking on air about Book of the Hopi. A friend of Craig Carpenter's happened to be listening and brought Carpenter into the studio. Out of that, Carpenter arranged for the radio personality Peter Bergman and 2 of the 3 men who would shortly form the comedy troupe the Firesign Theatre to attend a Hopi ceremony. They brought a tape recorder, and from those recordings they assembled a 4-hour broadcast, and then a run of radio documentaries putting the traditionalist faction's view of things on the air, with no real critique of what was actually going on inside Hopi politics. 4 hours of Hopi prophecy in 1966, on underground radio in the city where the counterculture was being manufactured. And I want to give those men their due, because they are the one bright spot in this part of the story. As they worked on the material, the Firesign Theatre began to notice what the counterculture was doing with native ideas, and they did not like it. So they backed away. Haley's assessment of them is blunt and generous. Of all the major figures in his book, they are the only ones who saw it and stopped. That December, Carpenter handed the editors of the San Francisco Oracle, the most beautiful and most influential underground paper of the era, a copy of the traditionalists' Hopi life plan. And on the 14th of January 1967, 20 to 30,000 people gathered in Golden Gate Park for an event that was billed, in words that came directly out of this milieu, as a gathering of the tribes. The human be-in, the event that announced the counterculture to the world and set up the summer of love. I'm not claiming the hippies were invented by the Hopi. The document supports something narrower and more interesting. The specific idea that ran through that whole movement that there was an older and wiser American way of living that had been buried under concrete and machinery, and that a small people in the desert had kept it alive and were now warning everybody that the machine was going to eat itself. That idea has a traceable path. It runs from a group of exhausted old men on Third Mesa, through a Christian anarchist ex-convict, through a self-appointed messenger, through a comedy troupe's tape recorder, onto a Pacifica broadcast, into an underground newspaper, and out into Golden Gate Park. And every single step in that chain, after the first one, was a non-Hopi deciding what the Hopi meant. Which brings us to the observation that reorganized how I think about this entire subject. Armin Geertz, working through the record in detail, identified a specific hinge point. Around 1949, he argues, Hopi prophecies were severed from their clan context by Hopis themselves and made universal. There is a great deal packed into that sentence. Before 1949, a prophecy belonged to a clan. It was that lineage's inheritance, recited by people entitled to recite it, meaningful inside a specific religious framework, tied to specific ceremonies and specific obligations. After that, it became a message to mankind. And a message to mankind is portable. It has no owner. It can be photocopied, translated, printed, broadcast, adapted, sold. The moment the prophecy stopped being the property of the Fire Clan or the Bear Clan and became a warning for everybody, it became copyable. And once something is copyable, it stops belonging to you, no matter what your intentions were. The elders did that for a reason I find hard to argue with. They had just watched two cities disappear, and they had concluded, correctly as it turns out, that the danger was no longer local. If the whole world was now at risk, the whole world had to be told, and you cannot tell the whole world in the language of a clan. But if you are looking for the moment the tap was opened, the evidence puts it in 1949 rather than 1958 or 1963. Everything after, the paperbacks and the festivals and the radio shows and the thumbnails, runs downstream of the point at which a warning that belonged to a family in a village became a warning that belonged to nobody. That is not a thing anybody announced. It is a thing you can only see by lining up what came before against what came after. And while all of this was happening, while the Hopi were becoming a symbol in San Francisco and Los Angeles, something was being done to their actual land, not symbolically, physically, with machines. And it is the single most important thing in this story, and it is the part that never gets told. Chapter 9. Black Mesa. Underneath the Hopi and Navajo reservation sits Black Mesa. It is an elevated, bowl-shaped plateau of about 4,000 square miles, and the Hopi villages sit on its southern edge. It is the source of the springs, and it holds one of the largest low-sulfur coal deposits in the United States, sitting close to the surface, ideal for strip mining. For a long time the mining companies assumed it was untouchable, because it was reservation land. Then, in 1951, the Bureau of Indian Affairs appointed a lawyer named John Sterling Boyden as land claims attorney for the Hopi Tribal Council. Boyden was a prominent, well-connected natural resources attorney from Salt Lake City. He worked for the Hopi for years. He was central to establishing the council's authority over reservation land. In 1964, Peabody Coal signed a lease with the Navajo Tribal Council. In 1966, with Boyden brokering, the Hopi Tribal Council signed too. The two councils together granted mining rights across tens of thousands of acres of Black Mesa, along with rights to the water underneath it. And here is the part that was not known at the time and only came out decades later, when researchers went through the archives. While John Boyden was representing the Hopi in those negotiations, he was also on Peabody's payroll. He was working both sides of the same deal. It is one of the clearest breaches of legal ethics in 20th century American resource law, and it produced a lease on terms that were, to put it gently, extremely advantageous to the mining company. The traditional Hopi opposed it. They had already been opposing it for years. Back in March of 1949, the hereditary chiefs and religious leaders of four villages, Hotavilla, Shungapavi, Mishongnovi and Shipaulevi, had written directly to President Harry Truman, telling him that the land had been given to them by Masao, that they were bound by religious instruction to guard it, and asking the United States to stay out of their affairs. Truman ignored it. The traditionalists went to federal court to stop resource extraction on the reservation. In January of 1965, the case was thrown out on the grounds that the courts had no jurisdiction over an internal dispute and that the council, being recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had acted legally. So Dan Kachongva, then about 105 years old, went over the court's head and urged President Lyndon Johnson to investigate the council directly. None of it worked. The mines opened, two of them eventually. The Black Mesa mine and the Kayenta mine, together one of the largest strip mining operations in the country, producing something like 14 million tons of coal a year. And then there was the water. To move the coal, Peabody built a slurry pipeline. They ground the coal into powder, mixed it with water, and pumped it 273 miles across the desert to the Mojave generating station at Laughlin, Nevada, which in its day was described as the most polluting coal-fired power plant in the United States. The water came out of the Navajo Aquifer, directly beneath Black Mesa. It is the sole source of drinking water for the Hopi and for tens of thousands of Navajo. From 1970 to 2005, they pumped roughly 4,300 acre-feet a year out of it. That is about 1.3 billion gallons every year, for 35 years. Put that in terms you can actually picture. A single year of that pumping would cover roughly 6.5 square miles of desert under a foot of standing water. Across the full 35 years, the running total comes to something over 200 square miles under a foot of water in a place that gets under 10 inches of rain. And the aquifer does not meaningfully recharge from normal rainfall out there. What comes out does not go back. Springs that had run for as long as anybody could remember began to fail. Wells dropped. Vegetation that had held that ground stopped receding. In 1996, a Department of the Interior Administrative Law judge found that numerous Hopi sacred shrines and burial grounds had been destroyed by the mining operations. At a public hearing in 1989, a Hopi woman named Marilyn Masayezva stood up and told the government that the water had become more valuable than the coal and that no amount of compensation could replace the source of life for her people. Put the whole picture together. You have a community whose entire religion is a covenant to keep the land in balance, whose ceremonies are about calling rain into a desert, who prove their faith by growing corn where corn should not grow, using water that comes only from snowmelt and monsoon, held in the ground. And a corporation with a permission slip signed by a council those people never recognized, negotiated by a lawyer secretly working for the other side, is pumping the ground dry underneath them to wash coal, so it can be piped hundreds of miles across the desert and burned to make electricity for Southern California. The elders did not experience that as a metaphor for the prophecy. They experienced it as the prophecy. Right there, on the clock, their own water being taken out from under their own feet to run machinery they had refused to let into their village. Dan Kachongva did not live to see how it ended. He died on the 22nd of February, 1972, at Hotevila, at somewhere around 112 years of age, the first of the 4 to go. But 2 years before he died, on the 29th of January 1970, he sat down and gave a long talk. He told the whole story as he understood it, from the emergence of the people, through the attacks that led to the founding of Hotevila in 1906, through the schools and the money and the police, and out to what he believed it meant for America and for the world. Somebody recorded it. And when they asked his permission to publish it, he agreed, on one condition: it must never be sold. He said that selling Hopi's teachings would be like selling his own mother. Remember that condition, because within 20 years there would be an entire publishing industry built on this material and a whole circuit of paid speakers and eventually an advertising ecosystem, and it is worth knowing that the last leader of the Sun clan at Hotevila, the son of the man who drew the line in the dirt, saw it coming and drew another line, which is exactly what he and the other elders did next. Because if outsiders were going to keep publishing the Hopi were going to publish themselves. Chapter 10. The newspaper that would not charge. In 1975, in a village that had spent decades refusing to let power lines in, the elders of Hotevila started a newspaper. They called it Tekwai-Kachi. In English, it is usually rendered as land and life, and the two words together carry the idea that those things are not separable, that you cannot have one without the other. It ran for 11 years, from 1975 to 1986, 44 issues by most counts. A few sources say 45. They were short, anywhere from 2 to 12 pages, printed on stapled sheets. They were produced as a kind of samizdat, an underground paper in the middle of the Arizona desert by men in their 80s and 90s about a religious and political struggle that most of America had no idea was happening. The staff was named openly in the pages. The first issue lists 5. David Monongie, Jack Pongia Yesva, Paul Sewa Manewa, Dan Everhema, Amos Howasser. Later issues add a 6th, Louis Nahar, who also signs its letters as one of the traditional and religious leaders of Hotevila. Those are not pseudonyms and they are not composites. Those are the men. 2 of them, Monongie and Everhema, had personally witnessed the split at Oravi in 1906. Printed on the masthead was a shield symbol, a circle quartered with a smaller circle in each quadrant, identified in later transcriptions as the shield of the war leader Kachina. And the caption they set beneath it said that together with all nations they protect both land and life and hold the world in balance. And in the details of how they ran it, you can read the whole ethic. There was no subscription rate. The very first issue says the publication is made possible through voluntary contributions and asks only that you send your name and address. It does add in one line that subscriptions might become available later. They never really did. By the issues that came out a couple of years on, the masthead was stating flatly that there is no regular subscription rate. If you wanted it, you wrote to Tequaikachi, Box 174, Hotavilla, Arizona, and they sent it to you. They would not put a price on the teachings. Kachongva's condition applied to an entire newspaper for 11 years. Set that against what was already happening in the outside world by 1975. Paperback editions selling steadily. Lecture circuits. Workshops. A market forming around exactly this material. And these men, who had almost no money, and who were at that moment fighting to keep a coal company from draining their water, were mailing out their own words for free to anyone who asked. The first issue states the reason they started it, and it is sharper than a general complaint about outsiders. They set out to correct the things that had been said and printed about the traditional Hopi by people who oppose the Hopi way of life and are working to modify the old teachings. They add that they will not try to indoctrinate anybody. They just want the children of today to understand their elders and not to hate them. Which means that from 1975 onward, the Hopi traditionalists had a public, printed, English-language answer to the question everybody asks. What do the Hopi actually say? It was archived. It has been online for years, free to read at more than one address. Anybody with an internet connection can go and read 44 issues of it this evening. Issue number 3, for instance, is where you find the Hopi's own telling of the 1906 split, including Yukiuma's line about the land being his from that point on, framed inside the account of the Fire Clan and Bear Clan tablets and what they meant, not filtered through an anthropologist, not novelized. Their version, in their words, published by them. And here I have to correct something you will see repeated all over the internet, including in places that ought to know better. Kachongva's long talk is often said to have been published by Tequaikachi in 1972. It cannot have been. The newsletter did not exist until 1975. The 1972 printing was done in Los Angeles by a group calling itself the Committee for Traditional Indian Land and Life, and it was reissued as a booklet in 1975 under the title Hopi, A Message for All People, which is its own small, sour illustration of the problem. Even the text that came with an explicit instruction never to sell it went out into the world through an organization several hundred miles away in a California city, run by people who were not Hopi. So we have had the source material the whole time, and the version that took over the planet came through a Methodist minister, a novelist and a late-night radio show. Set the two of them side by side and the shape of the problem is hard to miss. A newsletter from Hotavilla, written by named elders over 11 years dealing in land and water and ceremonies in the coal mine. Almost nobody has read it. And a text of unverifiable origin promising a blue star and a countdown which reached tens of millions. That gap is no accident, and it is no conspiracy either. The reason is more ordinary than either, and considerably more depressing. Chapter 11. A Novelist and a Tape Recorder. But first I have to show you where the modern Blue Star actually comes from. Not 1958, the version you have actually read, because it is much more recent than you think, and the trail is remarkably specific. Start with the book that put the phrase into print in the first place. In the late 1950s, a Hopi man named Oswald White Bear Fredericks, of the Coyote clan, approached a foundation in New York looking for funding to produce a history of the Hopi people. The money came through, and the writer chosen for the job was Frank Waters. Waters was a novelist, not an anthropologist. He was a serious and well-regarded writer of the American Southwest, best known for a novel called The Man Who Killed the Deer, and he had spent his life around native communities, but he did not speak Hopi and he had no formal training in ethnography. Brian Haley goes further and argues that Waters had himself taken on an Indian identity to give his writing more authority. Haley also makes the point that Waters walked into a live political fight without understanding it, and ended up putting one faction's version of Hopi tradition into print as though it was simply the Hopi version. The project took about 3 years. Waters lived on the reservation, in hard conditions, below a landmark called Pumpkin Seed Point. White Bear did the actual collection. He would take a small battery-powered tape recorder out to Hopi speakers, record them, then play the tapes back at home, translating into English aloud for his wife Naomi, who typed the results for Waters to work from. White Bear also interpreted when Waters interviewed people directly, guided him to the sites, and made the drawings of the petroglyphs. The result, published in 1963, was Book of the Hopi. Around 30 elders contributed. It has never been out of print for long. It has sold in huge numbers, and for 2 generations it has been the single most influential book about the Hopi in existence. It is also, and this is not a small caveat, contested by a great many Hopi people who say it presents material that should not have been published, and presents it wrongly, filtered through a chain of translation and a novelist's shaping instinct. And there is a detail about what happened next that I think is the bleakest thing in this whole video. Book of the Hopi sold so well, and so many visitors turned up on the reservation asking for it, that the bookstore at the Hopi Cultural Center had to stock it. Not because anybody there endorsed it, because that's what the tourists wanted, and the money was needed. So a book that many Hopi consider a misrepresentation of their own tradition ended up for sale on their own mesa, bought by their own visitors. And Haley's observation is the part that lands. A generation of Hopi young people grew up seeing that book on that shelf in that building, and reasonably concluded it must be accurate. Frank Waters is where the phrase Blue Star Kachina, Sequasahu, enters the written record. Jason Colavito, who went looking for it, could not find any reference to that name anywhere earlier. Not in the extensive ethnographic literature on Hopi religion, and there is a lot of it, going back to the 19th century. Not in Jesse Walter Fuchs, who catalogued Kachinas in extraordinary detail, nowhere. His conclusion is that as a named figure in the form we now know, it is a 20th century arrival, and there is one claim that stopped me cold when I found it. In the early 1970s, a man named Robert Morningsky was circulating material about a blue star, and according to an account published in an alternative newsletter in the 1990s, Morning Sky later said flatly that the blue star does not exist in Hopi legend, teaching or mythology, and that it was a term he had invented himself in the early 70s, which had then been taken up by other people who claimed to have received it from Hopi elders. I cannot independently verify that admission, and I want to be clear about that. It comes to us second-hand through a source in the same alternative publishing world that produced the problem in the first place. Treat it as a claim, not a fact, but it sits alongside something firmer. And this is where I owe you the detail behind that date I gave you at the very start. The man who ran the paper trail down is Jason Colavito. He went hunting for the earliest confirmed appearance in print of the 9 signs themselves, the numbered list, the one attributed to that car ride. Not the Blue Star name which Waters gave us in 1963, the list. He worked backwards through the New Age publishing catalogue, and the trail stopped at a paperback called Rolling Thunder, The Coming Earth Changes, written by a man named Joey R. Jockmans and published at the front edge of the boom. Which leaves us with a hole in the middle of this story that nobody has ever filled. Multiple accounts say mimeographed sheets went round the churches in 1959, and I have no particular reason to doubt that something circulated. But no one has produced one. Not a copy, not a photograph of a copy. What sits between the ride and the printed text everybody now quotes is 21 years of hand-to-hand transmission that nobody can inspect. And things change when they're travel by hand. Ask anybody who's ever watched a family story come back to them at a funeral. Chapter 12, The Harmonic Convergence. Then comes August of 1987, and this is where it goes global. An art historian named José Argüelles, working with his wife Loy Dean, published a book called The Mayan Factor and announced an event. He had taken a framework from a 1971 book of poems by Tony Shearer about Quetzalcoatl, the 13 heavens and the 9 hells, and worked it into a claim that the 16th and 17th of August 1987 marked a hinge in human history. If 144,000 people gathered at sacred sites around the world and meditated at the same moment, the transition could be made peacefully. They called it the harmonic convergence. It is generally reckoned to be the first synchronized global meditation event in history, and it was enormous. People gathered at Mount Shasta, at Sedona, at Mount Fuji, at Machu Picchu, at Haleakala. By most accounts, far more than the required 144,000 turned up, and thousands of them came to the Hopi mesas, specifically to a sandstone panel of petroglyphs on Third Mesa that outsiders had started calling Prophecy Rock. No Hopi took part. Hopi elders publicly condemned the event. That single fact deserves more weight than it usually gets. By 1987, the version of Hopi prophecy circulating in the world had drifted so far that when its followers arrived at the actual place, the actual people wanted nothing to do with it, and what they left behind made it worse. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has documented repeatedly that New Age visitors began leaving crystals and other offerings at Hopi shrines and at the petroglyph panels. The visitors meant it sincerely. That is what makes it painful rather than simply rude. But leaving your own religious objects at somebody else's shrine, uninvited, is not homage. And the Hopi have said so in writing for decades. Even the name Prophecy Rock is not Hopi, that name was applied by outsiders. Chapter 13, 2 in the morning, and then came the last step, the one that actually created the text you have read. In 1997, comet Hale-Bopp arrived. It is one of the great comets of modern history, visible to the naked eye for a record 18 months, brighter than almost anything in living memory. Discovered at an extraordinary distance in July 1995, reaching its closest approach to the Sun on the 1st of April 1997. If you were around then, you remember what it did to the culture. It was a very bright object hanging in the sky for a year and a half, and a very large number of people decided it meant something. And on Art Bell's Coast to Coast AM, the biggest overnight radio show in America with millions of listeners, a man calling himself Dr. Robert Ghost Wolf appeared, and brought with him two men introduced only as Grandfather 1 and Grandfather 2, described as Hopi elders. Their names were withheld, the audience was told, because there had been threats, and on that broadcast they laid out the version that is now everywhere, that the Blue Kachina would first be seen at the dances, appearing to children in the plaza at a night dance, that the Blue Star Kachina would then physically appear in the heavens, that Hale-Bopp had been the twin Kachina, white and blue, and that a red one, the Purifier, would follow, that people would see animals born with deformities, frogs with extra legs, creatures being born with both sexes, earth changes, firestorms, those who walk as ghosts through canyons of their own making. That is the Blue Star prophecy as it exists on the internet today, that specific, vivid, poetic text. Not the 1959 pamphlet, not Frank Waters, that is 1997 talk radio. Robert Ghost Wolf has since been widely identified as having also used the names Robert Franzone and Robert Parry, and he has been described as a fraud by a long list of researchers, native and non-native. He died in 2005, and in that same year, 1997, the Hopi religious priesthoods met and voted to restrict outsider access to the villages. Then in 2002, the Hopi nation issued a formal public statement on cultural theft and misrepresentation. It condemned New Age interpretation and appropriation of Hopi religious practice, and it condemned self-appointed leaders and spokespersons. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office now operates a formal protocol requiring consultation and permission for research and publication involving Hopi intellectual property, and it states in plain language that the tribe reserves the right not to sell or commodify certain domains of knowledge at all. So the text that half the internet attributes to a Hopi elder in 1958 was, in the form you have actually read it, put on the air by a man using a false name, speaking for two elders nobody was allowed to identify, at 2 o'clock in the morning keyed to a comet that was about to leave. Every retelling since is a copy of a copy, and it would be very easy to finish that feeling smug, which is the wrong response. None of that means the Hopi have no prophecy. It means that this particular package is not it. Because while all of that was being assembled by outsiders, an actual Hopi elder was travelling the world under his own name, saying something completely different, and hardly a soul was listening. Chapter 14. The Rock with Two Paths. Before we get to that room in New York, I have to show you the rock, because he carried a picture of it with him, and because it is the one piece of physical evidence in this entire story that you can actually go and look at. Off Highway 264 on 3rd Mesa, not far from Hotavilla, there is a flat sandstone panel facing east carved with figures. At the left is a large human figure holding a bow. Most readings identify him as Marsor, or as the Great Spirit, and the bow held low is usually explained as the instruction to the Hopi to lay down their weapons. To his right, a vertical line runs upward, and from it, the path of life divides into two. The upper path is broad. It carries small human figures walking along it, and as it moves right, it breaks up apart into a jagged, zigzagging line. That is the path of people who have taken the technology and left the natural and spiritual law behind. It ends in chaos, and it does not continue. The lower path is narrow and it runs straight. Along it at intervals are figures of corn and a walking cane, which are read as long life and continuous life. That is the path of people who stayed close to the ground and kept planting. Two circles rest on the lower path. Most Hopi readings identify them as the shakings of the world, the two world wars. Some interpretations expect a third, and between the two paths connecting them, there is a short vertical line. That line is the reason I'm doing this video at all, because that connecting line is the way back. Panyatsiya himself, standing at the United Nations and describing this exact carving, called it a line that represents a choice, like a bridge joining the paths. Other retellings describe it as a ladder, a short line letting people climb down off the upper road before it disintegrates. Bridge or ladder, the function is identical. It is the last chance, which makes it an off-ramp, not a deadline. Everything about how this story has been sold to you for 50 years depends on ignoring that little line. A prophecy with an exit is not frightening enough to be entertaining. A prophecy with an exit asks something of the audience. A blue star that arrives on a date and ends, the world does not ask anything of anybody except that they keep watching. But I promised you honesty, so here are the complications, and they are real. The first is that there is no single authorized reading of that panel. What I just gave you is the interpretation that circulates most widely, and versions of it appear in Hopi sources and in Hopi-adjacent publications, but it is not stamped and certified. Different Hopi describe it differently, and several of the smaller figures on that panel get read in wildly different ways depending on who is talking. Some of those readings are plainly built out of 20th century politics rather than out of the carving. The Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has been explicit that interpreting religious material is not a free-for-all and does not belong to outsiders. The second complication is much stranger, and it has stuck with me. There are reports coming from older Hopi themselves that the panel has been modified. Specifically, that the small figures on the upper path, the ones now usually described as two-hearted people, did not always have heads. The elders remembered a time when those figures were headless, and that heads were added later, in modern times, by somebody. If that is right, then the single most photographed piece of evidence for Hopi prophecy, the thing people fly across the world to stand in front of, has itself been edited to match the story that grew up around it. I cannot prove that. It is a report, not a finding, and stone is very hard to date. But it is exactly the kind of thing that ought to make you careful, because it is the physical version of what has happened to the whole tradition. A real object, old and Hopi and authentic, with later hands added on top, each one making it a little more like what the audience already expected to see. Even the rock is contested, which is in miniature the whole story. Chapter 15, The House of Mika. And so we arrive at the 10th of December 1992, New York City, the General Assembly Hall of the United Nations, Human Rights Day, in the run-up to what the UN had declared the International Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Thomas Banyatsier is 83 years old. Of the 4 men chosen in 1948, he is the only one still able to make the trip. Dan Kachongva has been dead for 20 years. David Monongie, whose age nobody was ever able to fix with any confidence, drops out of the record in the late 1980s. Dan Evahima is 99 years old at Hotevilla and has 6 years left. Banyatsier himself told the assembly that day that he was the only one of the 4 still living, which is how he understood it, though the record on Evahima is less tidy than that. Banyatsier has been trying to get through this door since 1949. This was not a man who turned up once and got lucky. By most accounts, the traditionalists were sending people to the UN building as early as 1959. They came again and again. They were repeatedly refused an audience with the General Assembly and with other bodies. In 1972, David Monongie and 3 other elders took part in the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm. In 1976, Banyatsier spoke at the UN Habitat Forum in Vancouver. 43 years of letters, appointments, delegations, receptions, side rooms, and polite refusals. He was a farmer. He had no institutional backing and no budget, and for most of that time nothing behind him except a group of very old men on a mesa who had told him to knock 4 times. And he did. He told the assembly that the 4 knocks were completed in October of 1991, when he delivered a letter and the sacred prayer feather the elders had given him in 1948 into the Secretary General's office to a man named John Washburn. That was the instruction discharged. The speech 14 months later was the message itself, and on the 10th of December 1992 they let him in. He was the last speaker of the day. Before he spoke, Oren Lyons, the Onondaga faith keeper of the 6 Nations, who had been the first speaker that morning, gave 3 shouts to the Great Spirit. That is a formal announcement, a way of stating that what follows is being said in a spiritual capacity. Then Thomas Banyatsier walked to the podium of the General Assembly of the United Nations and sprinkled cornmeal on the floor beside it. Corn in that room. The one thing his people grow out of sand where corn should not grow, laid down on the carpet of the building where the world settles its arguments. Then he spoke a few sentences in Hopi. Translated, they said something close to this, that Hopi spiritual leaders had an ancient prophecy that one day the leaders of the world would gather in a great house of mica with rules and regulations to solve the world's problems without war, that he was amazed to see the prophecy come true, and here they were. And then, in the same breath, he pointed out that only a handful of delegates had bothered to stay in the room to hear the first peoples of the world who had spoken that day. That is the moment. That is the whole thing in one image. An old man reaches the door he has been knocking on for 43 years, walks through it, looks up and finds most of the seats empty. He gave his name and his clans, Wolf, Fox and Coyote. He explained that Hopi, in their own language, means something like a peaceful, kind, gentle and truthful people. He explained the covenant with Masor, the responsibility for land and life. He noted carefully that the Hopi have never made a treaty with any foreign nation, including the United States, and that they have kept their agreement for centuries anyway. He said the United Nations was standing on the native homeland. He said it talked about human rights and equality and justice, and that in all its years the native peoples had never had a real opportunity to address it until that day. He and Oren Lyons held up a picture of the rock together. He talked about the two paths. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he had been given 10 minutes. And then he described what was coming, and this is the part I have not been able to shake. He said that on that day, the 10th of December, 1992, you could already see increasing floods, more damaging hurricanes, hailstorms, climate changes, earthquakes. He said that animals and birds were giving warnings by behaving strangely, and he mentioned whales beaching themselves. He asked why the animals seemed to know something was wrong with the earth, while most humans acted as though they knew nothing at all. He said that if humanity did not wake up to those warnings, the great purification would come, and he said the other half too, which almost never gets quoted. He said that if people returned to spiritual harmony and lived from their hearts, they could have a paradise in this world. He asked the assembly to actually do the thing written on their own wall outside, about beating swords into plowshares and studying war no more. And then there is the weather, which I include only because it isn't in the record, and because leaving it out would be a kind of cowardice in the other direction. The night before the indigenous delegates spoke, there was a total lunar eclipse over New York City. The sky was clear and people watched it. The evening after Banyatsia's address, the wind came up and it started to rain. The forecasters had been calling for a snowstorm. What arrived instead were the worst floods in the city's memory. Major highways along the coast were washed out, and the United Nations building itself flooded in its lower subfloors, which knocked out the heating and air conditioning, and the entire staff was sent home at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The next day, in a ground floor meeting room, native delegations were meeting with representatives of various UN agencies. Thomas Banyatsia asked everyone present, including the UN officials, to get up and form a circle, none of which means anything, necessarily. Nor'easters hit that coast every December, and eclipses run on a published schedule. But I understand exactly why the people in that room have never stopped telling it. An 83-year-old man walks into the world's parliament, warns of floods and storms and a climate turning against us, and inside 30 hours the building is evacuated because the sea is in the basement. Coincidence is how meaning gets made in every tradition on Earth, including ours. Make of it what you like. What I will not tell you is that an old Hopi farmer predicted climate change. That claim is bigger than the evidence supports, and it flattens what he was actually doing. What I am telling you is narrower and, I think, more impressive. In December 1992, 6 months after the Rio Earth Summit, at a moment when climate change was a specialist scientific concern that most governments were still treating as a distant hypothesis, a man stood in the General Assembly and described floods, intensifying storms, hail, disrupted climate, and animals behaving in ways that indicated something fundamental had gone wrong with the biosphere. He connected all of it to a single cause, which he named as a civilization living out of balance and taking more than it returns. He was not working from models, he was working from a tradition about balance, from 60 years of watching what was done to his own land, and from the plain evidence of a man who farms without irrigation and therefore has to read the sky more carefully than almost anyone alive. Whether you call that prophecy or observation is, I think, genuinely up to you. I lean one way, you may lean the other. But the record is the record, and it is not a pamphlet and it is not a paperback. It is the proceedings of the United Nations, and he would have wanted you to hear the other side, so here it is. Banyatsia did not speak for all Hopi. He could not. The traditionalists who sent him were in open conflict with the tribal council, the government Washington recognized, which regarded their claim to speak for the tribe as illegitimate. There were Hopi who saw a genuine elder carrying out a sacred instruction, and Hopi who saw a faction leader making a move on an international stage. Serious people held both views, and Banyatsia had by then spent decades inside a network of non-Hopi enthusiasts, some sincere, some opportunists, all of them shaping what he could say and wear. He knew what he had done, though. After that speech, he said he had completed the mission his elders gave him in 1948. Thomas Banyatsia died on the 6th of February 1999 at Keams Canyon, Arizona. He was 89. Dan of Ahima died the same year, at around 106. 47 years between the bomb and the speech. 44 between the meeting that chose them and the moment one of them got through the door. Kachongva had been dead for 2 decades by then. Monongie had gone. And Evahima was 99 years old on a mesa in Arizona, far past travelling anywhere. Chapter 16. The Last Witness. And there is one more scene, and it is the saddest and most fitting in the whole story, because it repeats the original problem exactly. Dan Evahima outlived almost everyone. The boy who watched the pushing contest at 13 was, by the mid-90s, well over 100 years old, the last living witness to the founding of Hotevilla, and one of the last of the 4 messengers. And he came to a conclusion that must have been agonizing. The elders who knew the teachings were dying. The young people who might have carried them were, in his assessment, not coming forward in the numbers needed. And the outside world was already awash in versions of Hopi prophecy invented by people who had never set foot on the mesa. So in the mid-1990s, at somewhere over 100 years of age, Dan Evahima chose an outsider as his vehicle. A writer named Thomas E. Males worked with him on 2 books, one on Hotevilla itself and one setting out the prophecies, instructions and warnings as Evahima understood them. Evahima signed an affidavit approving the second, which is the closest thing that exists to an authorized written account, and which is precisely why people fight about it. Sit with the shape of that for a second. A man who had spent his entire life inside a community that had refused over and over at enormous cost to hand its knowledge to outsiders, decided at the end that handing it to an outsider was the only way to save it. And the book that resulted went into the same commercial marketplace as everything else, on the same shelves, sold at a price, next to the paperbacks the elders had spent decades objecting to. Kachongva said selling the teachings would be like selling his mother. 50 years later, his colleague concluded that the alternative was watching them vanish. I do not think there is a clean way to feel about that. Call it hypocrisy and you have missed it. That is simply what happens when every available option is bad. Dan Evahima died in 1999, the same year as Thomas Banyatsia. Which brings us back to the question I opened with, and it is time to answer it properly. If that is the real story, and the real story is astonishing, then why is it not the one you know? Why did the Blue Star win? Chapter 17. The Invention of Prophecy. The most careful answer to that question came from a Danish scholar at the University of Aarhus. Armin Gertz spent much of his career on Hopi religion. He worked on their altar iconography, their ceremonial language, their narrative traditions. In 1992 he defended a dissertation on Hopi prophecy, and in 1994 the University of California Press published it under a title that has caused a great deal of trouble ever since: The Invention of Prophecy. You can see immediately why that title gets people's backs up, and you can see why it gets quoted selectively by people who want to debunk. But Gertz's actual argument is not the one either camp wants, and it is considerably more interesting than a takedown. He does not say the Hopi made it up. He says, first, that Hopi prophecy is genuinely indigenous. It grows out of their own emergence tradition, the account of how the people came into this world and what they agreed to when they got here. It is real, it is old, and it is theirs. The category exists, it always existed. Second, he says it was clan-based and collective. Prophecy without prophets, held by lineages, recited by those entitled to recite it, embedded in ceremonial life. Third, he identifies the change. Around 1949, that Hopi material was gathered up, detached from its clan context, collated, and turned into something universal by the political movement he calls the traditionalist movement. The modern, apocalyptic, world-facing version, the one with a message for all humanity, is a 20th century construction assembled out of authentically old material for reasons that were partly religious and partly political. Fourth, once it existed in that portable form, it was picked up by non-Indian movements, cults, and interest groups, each of which used it for their own ends. And then he says the thing that I have not been able to stop turning over. He argues that in the course of all this, the traditionalist movement subtly co-authored the stereotypes that Europeans and Americans already held about Indians. That line is doing something subtle, so let me slow down on it. He's not saying the Hopi were passive victims of misrepresentation. He's not saying they were frauds either. He is saying something much more human and much more uncomfortable, which is that both sides were writing the script together. The outsiders arrived wanting a particular thing. They wanted an ancient, pure, ecological people untouched by modernity, holding a warning for a civilization that had lost its way. And the Hopi traditionalists, who were fighting for their land, their water, and their political legitimacy against a federal government and a coal company and a council they did not recognize, discovered that this was the one story the outside world would actually listen to. So the story got told, and each retelling shaped the next. And over 40 years, a genuine religious tradition and an outsider fantasy grew into each other until you could not cleanly separate them anymore. Geertz also documented methodically that in the cases he examined, the specific signs identified as already fulfilled were composed after the events they supposedly predicted, not maliciously. That is simply what happened. And in his book there is one photograph that captures the entire absurdity of it better than any argument. It is a picture of Thomas Banyatsier at a Hollywood press conference. He is standing between Elizabeth Taylor and John Voight. That is the trajectory. A line scratched in the dirt outside a village on Third Mesa in 1906 by an old man who had just lost a shoving match. To a village founded overnight before winter, to a prison island in San Francisco Bay, to a federal prison camp in Tucson, to a mimeographed church pamphlet, to a paperback, to a Pacifica radio broadcast, to Golden Gate Park, to a Hollywood press conference with 2 movie stars, to a global meditation event the Hopi condemned, to late-night AM radio and a comet, to a thumbnail with a glowing blue light on it. Geertz has his critics too, and the objections are not stupid. An outside academic writing a book called The Invention of Prophecy about a living religion is doing something that would never be tolerated in reverse, and the framing hand's ammunition to anyone who wants to dismiss native tradition wholesale. There is also a painful side effect the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office has acknowledged. When a community closes ranks after decades of exploitation, careful scholars get shut out alongside the frauds. Brian Haley's 2024 book traces the same network in more detail and lands in a similar place, and Geertz endorsed it. Haley's summary of the whole affair is a phrase I keep coming back to. A cavalcade of misguided people trying to save the world. Not villains, not con men mostly, people who meant well and did damage anyway. Chapter 18. Why the Blue Star Won. So, why did the Blue Star win? Not because of a cover-up. There was no cover-up. The real material was published in English by the Hopi themselves, for free, and it has been sitting on the internet for 20 years. It lost for a much simpler reason. A blue star is portable, and I want to be clear that what follows is an explanation rather than a discovery. Nobody sat down and designed this, but when you lay the failed predictions out end to end, the mechanism is not hard to see. A specific datable cosmic doomsday, a thing in the sky you can point at, is the most shareable idea a human being can hold. It attaches to anything. It attached to Sputnik falling out of orbit in early 1958. It attached to Skylab. It attached to the Space Shuttle. It attached to Hale-Bopp in 1997, and to Comet Elenin in 2011, and to Comet Ison in 2013, and to whatever bright object is currently on its way in. It got welded onto Nibiru and Planet X, which is itself a claim that originated in the mid-90s with a woman in Wisconsin who said she was receiving messages from extraterrestrials through an implant in her brain. It got folded into the 2012 phenomenon, which came out of the same Arguelles material as the harmonic convergence. Every one of those predicted arrivals passed. Nothing happened, and every single time the prophecy survived intact, because a prophecy with no date can never be wrong. It just moves to the next comet, which is exactly why it spreads. It is a story shaped like a hook, and whether anyone intended that or not, it catches whatever comes past. Hold the other one up next to it, a warning about balance, about koya aniskatsi, a life lived in turmoil, out of harmony, disintegrating, gives you no date. It gives you no object in the sky. It does not tell you when. It tells you what you are doing, it hands you a mirror, and then it asks you to change something. You cannot forward a mirror to your friends. There is nothing to screenshot. There is no thumbnail. It does not resolve, and it does not entertain, and it implicates you personally, which is the one thing an audience will not forgive. That is why one of these travelled around the world and the other one stayed on the mesa. And here is the final turn, and it is the part I did not expect when I started digging into this. The Hopi idea that actually did conquer the world was never a prophecy at all. Chapter 19. One Word. In the late 1970s, a filmmaker named Godfrey Reggio was living in Santa Fe, working on a project with no dialogue and no narration made entirely of images. Time-lapse cities, slow-motion faces, clouds moving over canyons. He wanted a title, and he wanted it in a language that had never been written down, because his whole argument was that the literate industrial culture he lived in had run out of words adequate to describe its own insanity. Reggio knew a Hopi elder. He had met him by giving him a lift from the reservation to a doctor's appointment, and that they had become friends. The elder was David Monongie, one of the four messengers of 1948, Kikmongwe of Hotavila, nephew of Yukiuma, a man who had been alive at the pushing contest in 1906, who co-wrote Tekwa Ikachi, and who spent decades fighting the coal mine. Reggio went to the Lursum linguist Eckhart Malotki and his Hopi colleague Michael Lomatuwaima, and they gave him the word. Then he went to David Monongie and asked permission to use it. Monongie told him it was an ancient word and not one in common use. The word was Koya Aniskatsi. Crazy life, life in turmoil, life disintegrating, life out of balance, state of life that calls for another way of living. The film came out in 1982 with a score by Philip Glass. It became a cult classic, then simply a classic, and into the year 2000 the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry as culturally and historically significant. The end credits list David Monongie among the people who inspired it. Reggio put it in his own words later. He said Monongie told him that everything Reggio called normal, the Hopi called a bad normal. Everything he called real, they called unreal. Everything sane was insane. So the single most successful transmission of a Hopi idea into global culture is one word in a film with no dialogue, credited to an old man from Hotavila whose name not one person in that audience could have given you. And it is not a prediction. There is no star in it, no date, no cataclysm, nobody unmasking in the plaza. It is a diagnosis. And as far as I can reconstruct it, a diagnosis is what these men were offering the whole time, which is exactly what almost nobody wanted to buy. So where does that leave us? Here is where I have landed, and then it is yours, because I meant what I said at the start. I am not here to hand you a verdict. Everything with a date attached to it, the Blue Star and the unmasking and the countdown laid over comet footage, has now been traced back through 6 sets of hands. Not one pair of them was Hopi. A minister writing from memory, then a novelist working through a translator, then possibly a man who coined the phrase himself in the 70s. After that, a paperback about Earth changes, a festival the actual Hopi publicly rejected, and finally a broadcaster on a false name at 2 a.m. If somebody hands you that and calls it documented, they are either repeating something they never checked, or they are counting on you not to. Be careful with it. That does not mean throw it in the bin, it means holding it loosely, and with your eyes open the way you would hold anything that reached you by that route. But underneath it is something extraordinary and completely real, which has been sitting in plain sight the whole time. A group of desert farmers who raise corn on 8 inches of rain a year, and who were told to hand over their children and would not do it. Whose leaders were shipped to a prison island in San Francisco Bay and written up in the newspaper as murderers. One of whom lost a shoving match in September 1906, drew a second line in the dirt, and walked west into the cold rather than compromise. 2 generations on, 4 of their people looked at a photograph of a mushroom cloud and understood immediately and correctly that something in human history had just changed for good. The youngest of them went to prison for 7 years rather than sign a piece of paper. Then he spent 4 decades knocking on the door of a glass building in New York, mostly ignored and mostly unpaid, until at 83 they finally let him in and he found the room half empty. They did not need to predict a blue star. They looked at what a civilization was doing to the ground it stood on. They measured it against an agreement they had been keeping for 1,000 years, and they said out loud that it could not hold. To Truman in 1949, to Johnson in 1965, in a stapled newsletter out of a post office box in Hauteville, and then in the General Assembly of the United Nations. They diagnosed us, and they were early. Which brings me back to that short line on the rock, the one running between the two paths. Everything about the way this story has been sold wants that line gone. A bridge ruins the drama. An exit takes away the date and the spectacle, and puts the weight back on the person watching, which is exactly why the traditionalists kept pointing at it, and why Banyatsia, having just described a world thrown out of balance in the highest chamber on earth, went on to say people could still have a paradise here if they chose differently. That is not a countdown. It never was. It is an invitation, and you have given me a long time tonight, so you have earned the last word on it. When you look at the whole thing, the mazes and the mimeographs and the mushroom cloud and the empty seats in New York, which way does it fall for you? Maybe those old men were given something. Maybe in a tradition that was already close to 700 years old before the country around it existed, there was real foreknowledge, and they read our exact future the way you would read a page. Or maybe it is something rarer, and honestly harder to explain away, that they simply looked at the road we were walking and knew where it went, because they were the last ones still standing far enough back to see the whole of it. There is no wrong answer tonight. I know which way I lean, but I have laid the evidence out as straight as I know how, both sides of it, and you are perfectly capable of weighing it yourself. So tell me down in the comments, which way do you lean and why? If you think I have been too hard on the Blue Star, say so. If you think I have been too soft on it, say that. And if there is a Hopi voice or a source I have missed, I want to know about it, because I would rather be corrected than comfortable. I read them, all of them, and if this was worth the time you gave it, do one small thing for me before you go. Subscribe and tap the like button. That is genuinely all it takes. It is a quiet little signal that tells me there is still an audience for the careful version of these stories, the one that respects a living people and the facts at the same time, instead of the version with a glowing comet and a date on it. That signal is the only reason a video like this can exist. There is a companion piece waiting for you, and it goes at this from underneath. The Hopi are not the only people who left a warning carved into stone about a world that ended before ours. And when you line those traditions up next to each other, from the Andes to the Nile, something starts to look less like coincidence than it should. If tonight opened something up for you, that is the one to watch next. Everybody who came to those mesas over the last 70 years came looking upward. They came for the star, the comet, the sign in the sky, the dates circled on a calendar. They stood in front of a rock in the desert and photographed the part of it that promised a spectacle. And the men who actually lived there spent their whole lives pointing at the dirt, at the corn, at the water table, at the 8 inches of rain a year, and the fibbed covenant that came with it. The Hopi never asked you to be afraid of the sky. They asked you to take care of the ground. Keep your minds open, and until we meet again.